Hello everyone and welcome to Internally Screening, where today we're going to be doing another Hooptober review, but this time it's going to be a little bit different because it's going to be a double billing comparison type review, kind of like a versus, but we're going to be reviewing basically two versions of what is fundamentally the same film. We're going to be doing a review of 1998's Ring, directed by Hideo Nakata, and we're going to be doing a review for 2004's The Ring by Gore Verbinski. Ringu basically came out during the sort of 90s boom of J-horror, which we already covered on this channel with previous films such as we did Noroi, obviously, and we spoke about Cure at great length on our podcast a while ago. You should go check those out if you're interested in J-horror. We're both quite keen on that era of J-horror because it went on to become extremely cannibalized and deflowered, if you like, by the American remakers. And this is kind of the first instance of it, but I think it's quite an interesting comparison point because it started a terrible trend. But I think in this instance, it's a really interesting comparison because both of these films went on to be hugely influential on horror, particularly with the way the narrative is constructed and the aesthetics and the sort of analog horror. Should we start with the first Ring?
Sure.
And then we'll move on to the Gore Verbinski remake. What did you think of Ringu / the original Ring?
I'm a big fan of this film. I think the thing that strikes first and foremost out of this film is its atmosphere, and I guess in tandem with that, its aesthetics. The kind of technophobic angle is much more present here than it is in the remake, but it expresses something that we've talked about in our Noroi review. We compare Noroi a lot to The Ring. You know, obviously the whole setup around it being a videotape that carries with it a curse that you will die in 1 week, and the story that kind of takes you from the very built-up industrialized world to somewhere much more rural and isolated, and that kind of clashing, that culture clash that is happening in that point in sort of Japan's history. I kind of love the way it looks. It feels very bleak and cold, but there's a strange kind of warmth, and I don't know if that comes from just like the kind of the architecture of these places, like the wood paper paneled buildings that they're in. It has like a really specific sense of place, obviously, but it kind of lends it all, a very particular atmosphere. I like in this film how much they just fully go for the paranormal aspect out of the gate. Our lead character is not just an average journalist, she is a paranormal investigator of sorts. She is investigating specifically the videotape before the events of the film are even unfurling. Whereas by comparison in the remake, she's
just a journalist.
She's just a journalist, and to coax the characters into believing in the supernatural is a task in of itself, whereas I don't know a huge amount about Japanese culture, I will admit, but it seems from what I've seen that spirituality and the beliefs in certain things in and around the occult is just much more commonplace there. And so the idea that you would call upon your psychic ex-husband as your like go-to for tackling this murky mystery doesn't seem super out of place, even though to a Western audience I guess it's kind of got a hokey quality to it, but I kind of like that it just embraces it. I like that there's kind of no pretense to all of it. It's just very kind of it's straight down the line.
In a way, I think it's a slightly more straightforward film thematically than the remake, which I think is slightly more ambiguous and a little bit more cynical and more interested in going into the real themes of like abuse, because ultimately I think both of these films are about cycles of abuse and how generationally that can be passed down. I think that's kind of what it is roughly going for, although I would agree with you that this film there's a much more ever-present theme of the modern encroaching upon the old and the sort of sacred and mystical. As far as I'm aware, I think you're right. I think there is a much more ever-present sense of spirituality in Japan versus something like America, where you have obviously predominantly Christians, so that sort of fades into the background a bit. There aren't the same sort of shared cultural experiences, especially with Japan is somewhere that's obviously a lot more homogenous. So it's a very different cultural aspect, and I don't know if we want to jump straight to the ending, but I think the ending is a really, really good example of that. So if you compare the endings of the two films, and I guess spoilers if you haven't seen The Ring, but what are you doing? Go and watch both of them. The ending of The Ring is really interesting because in the original Ring, when she discovers what's going on and she realises, oh, I need to pass the curse on effectively. One of the big differences is in this film, she rings her grandparent, she rings the child's grandparent, her dad, and says, I need you to do a favour. And the implication is she's going to go and show him the tape and she's going to explain it to him and he's going to take the curse to save the son. Whereas in the American version, it's a lot bleaker and scarier, because it ends with the kid saying, what's going to happen to the person who watches this next tape? And then it just cuts to her face and her going...
Right.
And it's like, well, they're fucked, basically. So that sense of individualism versus like a sense of family and responsibility in Japan, and that sense that like, oh, I must do this for myself.
And there's actually like an over narration line of like two characters having dialogue, like two teenagers talking about the tape. It sort of in the future while she's driving to her grandfather's house, which says something along the lines of, oh, these are the things you have to do once you get the tape. Oh, you have to send it, you have to copy it and send it to someone within 7 days. Oh, you'll do it if you don't want to die, right? Kind of almost harking back to, not from this point, but echoing something that happens later, which is the whole like email, like chainmail thing you would get of like, Bloody Mary will visit you.
Are these films essentially where those chainmails came from?
I wonder.
They must have had a massive influence on that, because I remember even back on Facebook you used to get that stuff.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we're both too young to have experienced that email chain stuff. I don't think I ever had that, but you'd get it on Facebook.
I think I did a couple of times, back in the era of MSN.
Oh, really? See, I wasn't on that,
Yeah, it's interesting because they also, those characters know the mechanics of what's going to happen. So the implication is, oh, you can just kind of tell someone exactly what they need to do to avoid the curse. It's fine.
You send it on.
You just need to absorb the knowledge and then pass it on. Whereas in the American one, it feels like, oh, this is like a trial they need to undergo, and if you fail the trial, that's on you kind of thing. Like, you need to work this out for yourself.
Yeah, that's true there. You're left a lot more... Well, because I guess it's almost because the characters don't have the same shared cultural understanding with each other that they do in the Japanese version.
Yeah.
Like you say, in the American version, there's this sense of like, she has to figure out, is this a real supernatural thing?
Is this just some spooky thing that teenagers tell each other?
And then she has to go and sort it out once she's accepted and understood that. Whereas, in this one, they're just like, well, obviously.
Yeah.
And then they go straight to it. They have almost a jump start in that sense. I think they still come down to like the same like last day in the sort of climax of the film.
Yes.
But in the Japanese version, it does feel like they figure it out quicker, if you know what I mean.
But in the same breath, I mean, there's something in that scene as well where she kind of like, when she first realizes, oh, I've made a copy, it kind of pans up to her face. Or like, sorry, her face, she kind of like looks up from what she's doing and kind of, there's like a cold sort of steely look to her that's like quite uneasy, because it's like she realizes what she has to do, and there's a kind of almost like a coldness comes over her, like I have to do something destructive and selfish to protect my son, to protect my family. So while there is like a greater level of optimism in one sense, there is also a kind of more of a
sort of shamefulness to it.
Yeah, I suppose. Whereas it feels much more like, because you get the scene following that in the American version of her like getting the son to do like the copy and stuff, and that feels much more like she's protecting her family. Yeah,
it's more individualistic.
Yeah, again, yeah. But I guess the motivations are kind of interesting in that it's not so simple as like one is more positive, one is more negative. Like there are kind of, it has multitudes to it.
In terms of the original Ringu, I think basically the two big draws for this film are a couple of things. Number one is primarily just the narrative conceit of the film is very, very good and really, really engaging. Obviously, it kind of captured the imaginations. People were talking about that sort of chainmail stuff. Now that I think of it, I feel like that has to be massively influenced by this film and its popularity. Because I remember this being big, like maybe when I remember looking back and people talk about The Ring, that maybe they were referencing the American version, but obviously this is one of the, I think it's actually quite a few films, not that many, but it's one of the J-horror films that actually did really translate across the ocean or whatever to the US and to the UK and the West at large. Like I was saying, the two big things to see this film are, number one, the setup, and obviously one of the great things about J-horror films is that they feels like they love to have like a really solid mechanic, and I love the mechanic that they have with the creepy tape and then what happens when you don't follow it.
I love how simplistic it is as well. It like gets you in with the conceit very quickly, and I mean obviously it's kind of hard to evaluate it in those terms now, because this becomes such a sort of like a keystone in like the cultural fabric of film and horror and everything. It's hard to say like, oh yeah, it's a great like easy conceit to understand, because I've already had it explained to me a million times before I ever saw the film. But I think its simplicity lends that watchability to it, where it's so easily translatable across cultures, because you can get into it like that, no faffing around.
And I think the other big appeal of this film and the thing that really makes it stand the test of time is basically, in my opinion, like, of great horror films of their era, a lot of them you can kind of boil down to just having one really memorable image. So like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you got the like chainsaw dance at the end, or like Nosferatu when he's like he's silhouetted and you see his hand come out, or in Halloween where you see like Michael Myers like coming up behind her in the house.
Sure.
Those kind of things like just stick with people, and I think this film is the girl crawling through the TV is just the J-horror thing you think of. It's like so iconic, and the film is actually, revisiting it, I was surprised at how sparse it actually is in terms of scary bits. A lot of the film is fairly procedural and straightforward, and the directing is, it's not, when I say this, I'm not saying it in a bad way, but it's actually fairly plain. It's fairly straightforward and shows
it's not overly like
it's not very stylized.
Yeah, exactly.
Like if you compare it to something like Cure or Pulse from Kurosawa, then it's almost TV movie-ish. And again, I don't mean that in a bad way. I actually kind of like that
It's just
approach.
quite matter of fact.
It's pretty, it's like cut and dry.
it feels quite lived in that way. But I guess in some ways that kind of adds to...
It lends to the kind of analog feel of it, and that kind of goes with the themes of the film. I think that there's something kind of just charming about this film for people who remember that analog technology and like the graininess, or even people who don't remember it but have like a fondness for it. The feel of the film, which is very difficult to quantify, and it has this sort of grainy, gritty, stripped down feel to it, plus the whole theme of like using a VHS to pass on a curse. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, it's interesting, like comparing the aesthetics of the videotape, like the core of the film. It's actually quite like an interesting sort of counterpoint between the two, in the aesthetic differences between the two. Obviously, there's several years between them, so the technology has slightly advanced, because it was an era in which technology was like advancing by light years every like year or two. Like it was already out of date, which is not so much the same nowadays. That's still a present quality in society now, but back then it was...
It actually feels like CGI is getting worse now, so...
but that's because the CGI artists are being treated like shit.
I know,
But the difference in the videotapes is that like they're way grainier and more pixelated and more like, you know, like the cathode ray tube TVs, like the image quality is so much harder to make out. So like in the remake, they can pick out whose face it is, and they go, I know, like that face, let's go find out who that is. Whereas in this, like they have no fucking clue because they can't really make out the face. But that kind of graininess translates to the whole film, and then the sleekness and that sort of cold blue steely, it's almost more like a DVD, and it's not, but
I sort of see what you mean.
It's much more high res.
Watching The Ring, it just feels like a film that you would watch on the VHS anyways. Whereas I would agree, the American Ring feels a lot more like a DVD film. It feels like something you get from Blockbuster. It really has that vibe. They both have nostalgic qualities, but you're right. Despite the fact they're not actually that far apart, they actually feel like they're like a generation apart.
Because it's just that turning point
so huge,
at the turn of the century as well. Just like it had like a big effect, and like I think it is almost like a perfect archetype of that weird early 2000s obsession with like blue chrome, slightly green filters over everything.
Kind of an early example of that kind of gritty sort of post 9/11 aesthetic where everything was very shadowy and everything had to be kind of dark and
looked
grey.
Like cold.
Like, really cold. Just to sort of round things up on The Ring, I think as a film, like I said, it basically does everything it sets out to achieve. Going back on it, I do wish it had more scary bits in it.
Yes, it does. It does lull a bit.
You sort of got this midpoint during their investigation where some of the exposition around explaining what has gone on and the backstory of the girl isn't quite as effective, and we'll sort of come on to why I think it's slightly more effective in the American Ring.
I think a lot of the stuff on the island is handled better. In the remake, obviously we've talked about the fact that like one of the characters is psychic, and it's like okay, whatever. But then like a lot of the exposition comes through like a psychic reading, and it's like
a flashback as well.
And that scene feels it's not a bad scene, but it's like that whole piece of the film is a lot weaker.
It feels a bit almost irrelevant. It feels like a sort of random short story that doesn't quite have much bearing on the rest of the film. Thematically, it's an interesting explanation, and like you say, the scene isn't like bad. It's okay, but I don't really know why the scene had to be shown in that full amount. Like you could probably communicate what that scene communicates with a couple of lines of dialogue.
Sure.
And the scene just kind of happens, and then you go back, and it's like, okay, well, she was psychic. I don't know how that really has much of an effect on the rest of the movie as far as it goes. It feels a little bit unnecessary to me. I don't really.
How would you prefer they would handle that?
Well, I don't know. I think maybe the more interesting way to do it would be them going around and speaking to more and more people on the island, and maybe
Kind
getting
of
conflicting
piecing
pieces of
together.
information,
Yeah, yeah.
or like getting different version of the same events on what this girl was like or how it affected the family. And I think that would maybe have been more effective. But I mean, the way they did it was fine. I just felt like it was just a bit kind of throwaway.
It feels
it
almost,
kind of interrupts.
and
the
it's
film.
also kind of a shortcut to your like investigation if you can read the mind of the guy, or more or less
yeah.
read the guy's mind and be like, that's handy. He was
exactly.
was thinking about the exact thing I wanted him to be thinking about.
With a film that it feels like this part of the film really feels like it would benefit a lot from a bit more ambiguity, and the film is trying to be a little bit more straightforward than that.
Sure.
My personal preference, I prefer if they didn't do it that way. The only other thing I would say about this film is I don't think the acting across the board is as good as the remakes. I think that the two main characters are generally pretty good, but there's like some of the side characters aren't as good. I don't think the kid, it's really hard for me to say this, but I think the kid's kind of bad in the Japanese version.
He kind of just sits there and like stares like he doesn't really know where he is.
He doesn't really emote.
Which has like an eeriness to it, but I agree. There were points where I was watching it being is he just kind of not emoting because he doesn't know to emote, or is he?
But he's not supposed to be creepy. You're supposed to feel bad for the kid,
right. Yeah, I suppose.
He's not supposed to be
But
the
there's
scary
creepy
one.
things happening like within his sort of.
Yeah, but you're supposed to be worried for him. The way the film is structured is she wants to save her kid.
Yeah.
So like you don't want to be like emotionally, you don't want to be rooting for her to save the scary child. That doesn't make,
you're true. That's very valid.
That doesn't make sense.
He comes off much creepier than he does sympathetic.
And I also think the guy who plays, is it the dad? He looks like a sort of like a Japanese Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they speak to him on the beach.
Oh God, yes, yeah.
His acting's kind of weird to me. I don't know why. When I was watching that scene, I just thought he was kind of funny.
Okay, I think I think it's like another cultural thing is that like there's a certain level of melodrama with Japanese performances that you see from time to time. A lot of the performances in this film, a lot of the scenes in this film are very measured, very like calm and collected. But when things escalate to like an argument, they have an argument, for example, where they're on their sort of journey and they're staying away from home, and they're arguing, and it's the reveal where that's their son. Like,
the comparison between that, the way the films each reveal them, the difference in quality of performance, I think, is really notable there.
Yeah, and then there's the whole thing of like he says something really dismissive, like, "Oh, we should all die. Like, we should never have had a son.
We should never have had that son."
And she screams like, "Stop it!" And it's like it's all a bit hammy stage play. That whole
a little bit, yeah.
And things like that happen, that crop up here and there. But by and large, the acting is good. It's actually much more binary. It's either very withdrawn or very explosive. But I will say, I think the final scene in this film, the final...
You mean in the well?
No, the well scene is actually very good in this. I really like. I think it's handled well in both films actually. Although some people take exception in the American remake to how she's knocked down it by a big TV.
I kind of like that.
I don't have a big problem with it, but some people think it's very slapstick, and I could see that.
I like it.
Yeah.
I didn't know that people had a problem with that.
Yeah, in both, I like the caring, comforting nature. It's like it brings out the motherhood in them. Like, like they've kind of been neglecting their kids through approaching, trying to cultivate like a single working mother lifestyle. They can't balance it.
She has like a moment of motherly care for another child, and it's like the character coming full circle.
Yes, exactly. And I think I think that the beautiful thing there as well is that that scene feels like it's really angling the audience to feel like, oh, here's a scare. She's in the water. The hair's rising out of it, but it's actually instead turns into this really tender moment.
That's a good. I like that.
Yeah, and it sort of subverts your expectations. It's also really grim at the same time because like the skin peels off and like the eyes in the sockets.
It's a really strange scene when you think about it. Like the contrast of emotions that you're supposed to feel, because at first it's like terror. It's like, oh god, I'm in the fucking well.
Yeah, it's dark. She's been clawing her way out.
Being in the dark down a big fucking pit in water. I couldn't think of anything and it's claustrophobic. It's literally like all of anyone's normal fears like put into one, and there's something in there even fucking worse, and it's probably a fucking ghost. Oh my fucking god. And then the way that transitions into the sort of emotional climax of the film, and the reveal of like, oh, I'm helping you let go and I'm ending the cycle of abuse, even though that doesn't quite turn out to be true.
No.
But I'm doing this, and then this like weird, gross corpse that she like holds tenderly. It is really strange but effective.
It is very effective, and I think it's a bold choice that pays off really well. But the following scene, and the big payoff of the whole film, as you mentioned before, is absolutely fantastic. Even though it does have like the frustrating kind of thing of like a character sees something, falls over, and is unable to get up again.
Well, both films have that problem in equal.
That. Yeah, whatever. I allow it because the scenes.
It's horror trope. You got to.
The scenes play out in such a way that I will allow the convenience of it, the contrivance of it.
I can't get up.
Yeah, I think it's something that this film handles a lot better actually than the American version, because in the American version there's a lot of cutting to and fro because they try and turn it into more of an action scene or a sort of tense sort of drama.
Yeah.
Whereas this sits you in the room and it's like he's there watching this thing approach him. And then when she's finally in the room with him, the effect they have of like the reversed movement where she kind of like shifts awkwardly and like it's brilliant. It's that slight detail that turns something very ordinary into something incredibly uncanny.
I also just love the effect of how she comes out the screen.
Yeah.
It still looks really good to me. I've rewatched the scene after seeing the film, and I saw lots of people being like, oh, it looks really hammy how she comes out of the TV, or it doesn't look... I actually think the effect looks fucking great.
I think the effect looks great. I mean, maybe to more modern audiences, like, they can't get past like that kind of CGI, but it doesn't look bad by even this era standards.
It just has an unnerving quality to it that I really like, and the kind of... Maybe there is a level of sort of slightly poor effects going for it, but that adds to it a little bit.
Yeah, and it kind of lends itself to like the medium within the film of like her going from image to reality. It works within itself, but it also, I just think it looks good anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a great scene. The only problem I have is like, I don't know if it's a problem. I can't really work out what I prefer. The stylized way they die, where it kind of like freeze frames on them and it goes like negative black and white. Whereas in the American one, it's much more like...
It's fairly straightforward. It's just like scream and then you cut.
Yeah, well, no, but in the American one, you also get like the weird like flash editing of like their face and like flashing images, and their face goes all fucked up.
They have like in that final scene, you only see what he looks like in the end in like a sort of snap second. Yeah. I think there are pros and cons rather to the American and the Japanese final scene bit. I do really like the weird digital grain effect they have in the Gore Verbinski version, where she comes out looking sort of like an image, like a digital image. I do like in the Japanese version also that she comes out and she's literally just a girl. Yeah. There's something cool about that as well.
And also there's a claustrophobia to it because the apartment they've set it in is much more like contained. He's like in a small space with this horrifying like ghostly presence, where the other, it's the complete opposite in the American version. It's still an unnerving space because it's such like a weird apartment. It's very open and cold and industrial.
Yeah, there is something about the setting of the Japanese version I think is just slightly more frightening. But should we move on to The Ring?
Yes.
So The Ring 2002, which I know I said the wrong date earlier. The Ring is from 2002, and it was directed by Gore Verbinski, who at this point had basically done nothing. He had done like a few small, fairly successful films. Basically jumped onto this film and made a lot of fucking money with this. What I love about his take on this film is it feels, unlike a lot of other American remakes where what you're essentially... It felt like directors trying to do with films like, I remember the American remake of Shutter or the American remake of The Grudge, it felt like directors were just coming on and just doing the same thing as close as they could, but with American actors. And obviously when you try and do that, it's like when a band tries to cover a song but pretty much exactly as it was without adding their own flavour. It's like, well, why would I ever want to listen to this?
Exactly.
Like this gives me nothing. And those two remakes, I said those are the two that I can think of off the top of my head, and they're both really bad.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the Wes Craven Pulse, so I'm really interested
Wes
to see
Craven did the Pulse remake?
Yes.
Fuck, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that would be maybe an interesting one for us to do on Sloppy Sequels or something.
Yeah.
But what I love about The Ring is this, even though in many regards it's incredibly faithful to the original and covers almost...
Basically
some
everything.
of it is scene for scene almost, or like shot for shot. But it still does its own thing. It makes changes to the story and visually is completely different.
Completely.
And I love that it has that different flavour. And we've already kind of covered on this, but it has this sort of sickly green-blue tint to it. Especially the scenes in the city, which I really, really love, where it just has this kind of oppressive grim atmosphere to it.
They made a really smart choice by filming it in and around Seattle.
Yeah.
Because one, it's like, there's like, obviously, a handful of American cities that are so synonymous with America. Like, if you said it in New York, Chicago, or LA, it's like very specific. But like,
it's just generic enough.
But it's different enough. It has like a sort of almost uncanny flavour to it in of that, because you're like in America in a slightly more unfamiliar setting. You're in like a very wooded, cold, foresty area, like mountainous, I think. Like,
it kind of feels like Martha's Vineyard when they go to the island to me. I don't know why.
Sure.
I know it's not, but yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of, I guess, trying to pick a place in America that is as close to a sort of Japanese setting in terms of its like sort of
like the urban sprawl.
The geography of it, like that. Yeah, going from urban sprawl into thick, dense nature very quickly.
And it's cold.
It's cold. It's like,
and you can feel that coldness in the film.
It's
like,
very
really
like
strongly.
It's like embedded in nature.
We've already covered this basically, but in many ways it's very faithful. So like an example of that is like the opening scene of the film is basically exactly the same. You have the two girls talking about, have you heard about this spooky tape, blah, blah, and then one of them's like, I watched the tape, and then she's like, I'm just kidding, it's not that deep, or whatever, I'm not actually scared, and then eventually one of them gets killed. It's like basically exactly the same.
But they do extend the horror in it. They make that scene much more brief in the original, and they kind of extend it.
Well, this is a much longer film.
Yes,
in general.
Is, yeah, and they kind of make more of the bump in the night stuff, like the telly turns on a couple, more times, and it's like
there's a lot of fake scares as well.
A few fake outs and things like that. And
but it doesn't do it in a cheap way. I like how it's kind of like subtle, like where the camera will be placed at a certain way, where it's like, you remember you saying like, the fridge, and then they close it, there's nothing there.
Yeah. Like
there's no like annoying jumps or anything.
Or just like a figure standing in the corner. I was so waiting for it to do that sort of stuff. But yeah, it brings out more of it and I guess it makes sense because it's pulling from a lot more like Western tropes within horror, but it doesn't do it in a way that's tasteless. I think it's still well assembled. I also think that I watched this a couple times recently because I watched it and I hadn't watched the original Ring in a while, so then I was like, I need to get a better feel of both these because I didn't really click with the American version when I first watched it, so I watched them back to back the other night. What I originally kind of thought was them kind of undercutting the horror by having like a bit of a rug pull in that first scene. She goes to the door and it's like the water's trickling underneath it and she opens it and then suddenly you get like TV bang, like she's dead, like done. I kind of like that you're kind of building rug pull.
Yeah.
Like it has that like kind of like that release of tension kind of, it's on and off beat. Yeah. And I think that's like a really smart way of doing it.
Well, you're essentially building a lot of the scares in this film. You are, particularly in the Japanese version, a lot of the more minor scares you get throughout the film, you're really just building to that final scene.
Sure.
And by not showing you too much early on, that's obviously important, right? Because you want to make that final scene really hit. This film does have a lot more scares, like I was talking about. Yeah, I basically agree with what you're saying. You mentioned the tape of the Japanese version versus this one, and I do really, really like the way they do the tape here, specifically how they tie things in narratively. Yes. So in the Japanese version, they do this as well, as in a lot of the images you see on the tape end up becoming important sort of clues or elements, or they're sort of brought back. And I think the American version actually expands on this really well with a few like extra images. So there's like the image of the ladder, or the chair, or there's another one as well which I really like. Oh, sorry, and the horse.
Oh yeah,
I like the horses, and there's another one as well. Regardless, there's a lot of interesting images that get pulled back in interesting ways, and I like the way this film, when they go to that bit that we were sort of talking about, kind of lulls a little bit in the Ring where they're doing that investigation. Number one, when they go to the island this time, you get Brian Cox, which honestly he should have been in this film a lot more.
Yeah,
because when he shows up, well, he's also great when he shows up. He's a lot better than the Japanese film's equivalent. Yeah, his natural sort of gravitas, and just even though he's only in the film for a short bit, his character is like I immediately buy it because he's just such a good actor, and it's kind of criminal how little he is in the film. I like his balance of sort of, he's got that natural villain energy to him where it's like I immediately know that he's probably a bad guy, but equally the fear in that character feels very real as well. Like you can tell he is like kind of terrified.
He's kind of like beaten down as well. Like he's kind of lived with this like on his shoulders, like looming over him for decades now.
Yeah.
And he's just like tired.
Yeah.
But also
which is perfect for Brian Cox.
Yeah, but also very defensive as well. Like, he suddenly realizes what she's here for, and he's like, nah, get the fuck out. And his arc, his like story resolves in a much more gratifying and sure, like a much more literally explosive way than the Japanese version. But like, it feels like there's a real like, sense of like sort of retribution that happens with him.
There is a real American feel to this film, which is kind of interesting because it simultaneously feels really faithful to the Japanese version and has in many ways retains some of that kind of Japanese J-horror feeling to it, but equally feels very American in the way that it changes things.
Yes, well, I think that's a big part of it is the tone of the film, where the original feels much more like it is a film about the occult, about spirituality, well, about spirits. It's a supernatural film, and it's exploring like how do we end our curse. This film feels much more like a thriller or like a mystery film. Like we have to solve
like,
this,
uncover it. Yeah.
We have to uncover the truth, and it's similar. But there's like they feel very different in execution, and that adds a more of a sense of urgency in that kind of middle section of this film where there's more to find out.
Yeah.
And by having the tape be longer and full of more imagery, there's more things for like us to get more eerie moments. Like they're not big scares, but like these eerie kind of coincidences. She sees the ladder and she's like, "Oh, is this a sign?" And then they go to they find her room in the barn, and it's got like the chair and things like that. It all kind of like builds. Like, it's like they're finishing the jigsaw puzzle.
And I love the visual when the well shuts itself at the end and you see like the ring.
Yes.
Like that's such a cool way to tie that imagery in.
Yeah.
That that she was in. That's what she was seeing.
Yeah.
And that's what appears on the TV.
Well, it was interesting.
I always thought that was super cool. And I think the shot in the American version just looks fucking awesome when it closes over.
It's kind of almost more synonymous with The Ring than the original in terms of that one fixed image. And what's interesting, I was looking into like the kind of backstory of the film and things like that, and the original Ring kind of had like a sort of double or triple entendre of it being like the ring of light from the well, but also the ring as in the phone call you get.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Right. Okay.
And also the circularity of the film in that it like circles back on itself.
Well, I got that bit. I didn't realise the ring though.
Yeah. So like this film kind of answers it in so much as it has the image on the front cover, but I think there's a greater kind of ambiguity to it in the original.
Yeah. No, that is interesting though. I never realised that, but yeah, I do think this film. It feels to me, and maybe I think this is something that we've also briefly touched on, but because I think the performances from Naomi Watts and Martin Henderson as the sort of estranged couple / reunited couple, plus the fact that I think that the child actor in the American version is a lot better as a character and as an actor, and also the child actor is given a lot more characterization in this because the film is just a bit longer, I think, and you spend a bit more time with him. Because of all of that, I think this film brings home the themes of the cycle of abuse that I think is ultimately at the core of it. Yeah,
and like the echoing images of like familial relations, of like a family with a single child and two parents that are like sort of fractured. They're kind of like darkened mirror versions of themselves, and is almost like highlighting the struggles she's having in her own marriage and her own relationships.
Well, it's
like,
interesting.
Kind of like as she goes through that journey, she like seeks to mend it more with like the people she's around.
Yeah, I like the shot in this film of when they're driving home after everything's happened and you see them hold hands in the car from the perspective of the child as they go back, because it's kind of subtle, and maybe this is like part of my Western experience or my Western perspective. Naomi Watts at the beginning of the film, she doesn't seem like a bad mum.
No.
Like, she's not abusive herself, but she clearly is kind of obnoxious to people.
And distant.
Sort of distant to her child. Like, she clearly cares about her
kid.
And
I think a telling thing is that her kid always calls her Rachel. He rarely ever calls her by, like,
There's a distance there. It doesn't seem like a super unhealthy distance, and she clearly cares a lot about her kid. It's not like, oh, I'm a bad person. She's not like, oh, it's not really on the nose being like, oh, this is an abusive mother. This is a negligent mother. It's more just like, well, as a person, she probably values like her career quite high up, like close to the kid, like very close to the kid. And the other guy, he's just kind of like, he seems like a guy at college who got stoned all the time, and he's like really just kind of settled into his groove. He's not like a bad guy, but equally he hasn't really stepped up in life to like take on that challenge of parenthood. It's almost like a criticism of that kind of American individualism of like the way these people, because they have the freedom to do so, have just spurned the family unit and just kind of gone, well, we don't have to, and things are kind of working okay, so let's go with that. The way the film spins that in the end for them to all come together, and I think the way that mirrors the way that you have the couple who get the girl, and because they're desperate for a child, and the way it all goes wrong for them, to sort of mirror that and sort of bring into light how sort of self-centered all the characters have been this whole time. I think the way this film communicates that is a lot more nuanced and interesting.
I think it's also more emotionally impactful.
Yeah,
as well.
for sure. I get like this film. It's not like a film that's going to make me cry or anything, but I get like a sense of the character's journey is a lot more impactful.
There's a lot more weight to it. Yeah. Going off of that, the reveal of like how the girl Samara in the remake and Sadako.
Yeah, and I think the motivations behind it as well.
Yeah. There's the scene which reveals like how like they went in the well. In the Japanese one, it is a little bit comical because they have like a donk sound effect in it. And it's just like the sort of side profile of like the well, he comes up behind her, hits her, she falls in. Whereas it's revealed that the mother actually does it in this version. And so then like the sort of second-hand guilt of the father.
He wasn't the one to help her. She was like basically had to do it herself.
Yeah, yes, but also like, I don't know, it kind of adds like a level of nuance to his character as well, because he seems like far less like remorseful about the daughter's death, but simultaneously had like less of a hand in the death. But he was also just like a mean bastard to her in life, like forcing her to live out in the barn and things like that. And that scene of her like sort of choking her with like a bag, and pushing her in, not realizing she wasn't already dead by the time she hit the water. That's just so much better executed.
Yeah, it's really bleak.
Yeah.
It's really fucking bleak. That is a great scene, and then leads to that reveal as well, where they like, I don't think, is that the scene as well where they close the lid and you see the ring, and then it happens later on as well. But yeah, the way this film brings everything in narratively, I think is just one of the big draws in favour of the American Ring, because it just feels a lot more built out. It's exactly what remakes kind of should be.
Yeah.
Instead of just hopping on another film's success and just trying to replicate that straight up, it really feels like Gore Verbinski loved the original film and wanted to do his version of it. And then I guess another sort of very American element to this is that he came in and he kind of added a lot more like set pieces and stuff like that, where, you know, you have, for example, like the Brian Cox scene, which is like you said, he literally kind of explodes in electricity, or the horse, which I think is great. I really love the shot where they're like looking in the water and they're just basically waiting for the blood. That's what I was thinking of.
Oh, because it's the blood. The
blood from the horse.
It's like,
I love the way that's tied back from the tape, where you see it, and it's one of those things where you kind of realise, you're like, oh right, it's the fucking thing, and then you see it, and the way that happens, it, like the sense of dread you get from, she's watched this already and then she's seeing it happen. I really, really love that kind of stuff where you bring that really specific piece of imagery back and the character like realises. I think that's fucking awesome.
It makes her feel much more haunted.
She feels like quite helpless because it's like, this is all...
It's like it's been planned out for her.
Yeah, it's on tape,
Yeah. There's much less of a sense of that in the Japanese version. Something I think that the Japanese version has over the remake is the soundtrack. I think like the sound design, other than the donk, there's like weird, uneasy kind of rumbly kind of atonal key
a bit more
thing.
like ambient noise as
well.
But
yeah, they have like this sort of little theme / coda or whatever you want to call it whenever the date flashes up. And it feels like really like menacing, like horrible, like another day's gone, like this is sort of ticking.
The score for the American version is good though.
It's not bad. I think I just prefer.
I can see that.
Way but the American version feels a lot more sort of gothic and
I think so.
More kind of grandiose.
Yeah, for sure.
And the Japanese one is much more understated, much more kind of like murky and miserable and kind of pervasive.
But I guess basically what we're saying is that these are two very good films.
Yes.
And even though they are very similar, there's value to each of them, and they are actually, despite being super similar, there's enough nuance between the two of them that they're both worth watching.
100%. Yeah.
How would you rate each film?
Well, I think I would actually give both of them a 7 out of 10. But I think by a fraction, the American one does actually win out. Basically, just because I think it kind of answers a lot of things that I would want if I was set the task of remaking that original Ring, and I kind of wanted to expand certain things and give characters, like, you know, make that middle section more involving and give more of an arc to Brian Cox's character, you know, that father figure. This remake answers that. And like you say, it does feel like a love letter to the original, while also being like, let's have a go
completely
at
its own
like,
film.
can I improve things about it? Can I enhance this film, this experience? And that's not to say that it is 100% superior than it, but it's just, it has its value. And it holds up.
I totally agree. I would agree. I actually think that the US version of The Ring is, I'd say it's significantly better in so much as I would give it an 8, and I would give the original Ring a 7.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more meat on the bone with the US version, and it does a really good job of, like you said, expanding and building things out, but also doesn't make the mistake of over-explaining anything.
Sure.
Going in and having like ridiculous exposition dumps where you just build out the lore by having some character come in and explain something, or something really annoying like that. I just think a lot of aesthetic qualities to it I prefer, in the sense that I really love the cold, slightly cleaner take on the imagery, and I really like the way that the characters are characterized. They have a lot more to do. Like, for example, like the fact that in The Ring, the original version, the Japanese guy who's the husband, he's just kind of a massive arsehole the entire film. Whereas I really love in this film how there's a really human characterization to both characters, in that, like we discussed, they're both flawed, but I like that also they both have a hand in investigating certain elements in the way they like come around to things. I really enjoy it. So yeah, that's been our review of both Ring films. Maybe some point down the line we'll cover The Ring 2, or what's the like versus film with The Grudge?
I forget the name of it.
Like Samara versus something, right?
Yeah, we discovered on Shudder like a while back that there's like a versus film, like.
And I think it's like a 3D film as well.
Looking into it, there's a bunch of, in fact, there was a really recent one by the director, Hideo Nakata, called like Sadako 3D or 2. I think there's like a second Sadako 3D that came out like 2022 or 23 or something like that. It could be fun to dive into some of these.
If anybody is keen to see us go into one of those or do reaction to one of those, let us know.
Also, additionally, there's an interesting fact about the original, is that they released a sequel the very same year called Spiral, which they then retconned by releasing The Ring 2 years later.
But that was American, right?
No, that was the Japanese one. They made 2 films concurrently, but with different directors, put them out the same year. Spiral did really
But it was
bad.
the director of the first Ring that did the American The Ring 2.
Yes. Nice and confusing.
Right, okay.
So basically there are actually 2 different timelines essentially within the films. There's sort of a multiversal quality to the Ring films, in that there is The Ring and Spiral is Ring 2, but then they were like, Spiral isn't good enough, let's make The Ring 2 officially, the Japanese one, and then that goes off in one direction. But then they decided, let's make sequels to Spiral. So there's also sequels to Spiral.
Okay.
Which is nice and confusing.
If anybody is interested in us diving into the Ringverse, please leave a comment telling us if you would like that. If you don't want that, comment down below. Please don't fucking do that. That sounds like a terrible idea, because frankly you might be saving me from several terrible horror films. But obviously, give us a like if you like the review, give us a dislike if you dislike the review, subscribe to the channel because we've got more reviews coming, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.